Well, this evening we are not reading from a historical document. We are focusing on our quest for additional leadership at Truth Family Bible Church. And so tonight we have the opportunity to hear from Bret Kendall and to hear his testimony. Bret, please come.
Thanks, Danny. I'm going to have to put this down. I'm not quite as tall as Danny. So, looking over my life, I'm going to talk about two things, kind of my salvation story, as well as how God has worked in my life as a Christian. And this verse really describes how God has worked in my life. In John 3, verse 30, John the Baptist is talking, and he says, "He must increase, but I must decrease." Now, he's talking about his ministry, right? John the Baptist is talking about his ministry, where it needs to decrease because Jesus Christ is going to do his ministry, and Jesus' ministry is going to go forth. But John the Baptist was humble, and that's, John the Baptist was humble, and I was not. So God had to work that throughout my life, and in a variety of ways. Now, I grew up in the church in Santa Clarita Valley, where, Magic Mountain, everybody knows Magic Mountain. That's my hometown. That's where I grew up. That's where Katie grew up as well. And I grew up in the church, and I was a pretty confident kid about how I lived life. I asked many times. I remember sitting in Awana asking, they did like a raise your hand or whatever, private prayer. And so I asked many times Jesus into my heart, but really my motivation was I really didn't want to go to hell. I really didn't want eternal punishment. Now, there was no sense of really personal sin. Joel Beakey describes sin as treason against a holy God. I mean, Jesus is the King of Kings, and sin is really treason against him. I knew that there was sin out there. We talked about sin, but I didn't really have a personal conviction of sin. And I think as a result of all this, I was really just in the background in service in church. I ran the sound, I was a janitor, I did church setup, but it was always in the background. There was no foreground service for me. Well, all of that changed when I attended a prayer meeting, and where God graciously convicted me of my personal sin. I remember vividly, we'll talk about that later. I don't really have the best memory, but I remember vividly that account, like I was almost there. I remember that God convicted me of my sin and showed me the result of my sin, and that I really deserved truly divine punishment. But he graciously offered forgiveness through his son, and my life was radically changed at that moment as I committed faith in him, as I trusted in him. I was baptized then, and shortly after this occurred, this prayer meeting, this conviction happened, I began to desire the ministry. Versus, being in the background, I was a dedicated back row student. Literally, I was in the back furthest row of all my college classes and everything, whether I knew the professor or not. There was one professor I sometimes sat in like the second row, but that was unusual. Dedicated back row student for the most part. But I switched my major. I was at the master's college at the time, so I switched my major, which allowed me to take a bunch of Bible classes because I desired ministry. And then I began to step into the foreground of service, whether that was leading Bible studies, leading songs. I began to do some preaching. And this was totally out of my comfort zone. I mean, I was a dedicated back row student. I was in the background. That's what I did. I was not in the foreground of service at all. But at that point, God started to prepare me for ministry. I met my mentor, who was instrumental in my life. His name is Monty Martin. He was a seasoned pastor. He was a pastor for 30 years. And he really took me under his wing and began to disciple me into what ministers should do and what ministry was all about. So at that point, we planted a small church in Santa Clarita, and this was truly a glorious time. I mean, truly a glorious time. I learned at that point in the church, I learned the solid gospel. I learned about lordship and how that played together. I learned about union with Christ. Like I said, it was amazing. It was unbelievable, right? And I was married in 2000 and soon got pregnant and had, my wife soon got pregnant after that and had McKenna. And then James chapter 1 started to come into my life. Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials. Now, marriage and having kids is not a trial. Don't get me wrong. But verse 3, it says, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect, complete, and lacking in nothing. God uses situations in our life to promote sanctification, to promote spiritual growth in our life. And as you may be thinking, as a single person, well, I'm not selfish. Wait till you get married. I realize, whoa, I'm the super selfish. Like I said, I was a confident kid. Well, not really anymore once I got married. And once you have kids, that was nothing. You thought you were selfish when you got married. Wait till you have kids. Then you really understand how selfish you are. And at this point, God began to strip away self. God began to strip away self. He began this testing process really in my life, and he started to really press upon me that I needed to personally decrease and that he needed to increase. In 2004, we moved to Idaho. I continued in ministry and had more kids. And then trials began. I mean, I always had trials, but real trials began at this point. In 2012, my dad suddenly died of a heart attack in his mid-60s. And I was a train wreck for some time after that. But God taught me that life is frail, and it's a good reminder that he is sovereign and will take care of my mom. So my mom and dad at that point were living in California, in Santa Clarita, and we had moved up to Idaho. So, 850 miles apart. And I knew, I trusted that God would take care of her, and he has taken good care of her. And then, if that was a relatively, by comparison, a relatively simple trial in comparison to this next trial. In 2014, I was diagnosed with a brain tumor. In Romans, I learned the truth of Romans 8:28, which says that all things work together for good to those that love God. In God's providence, there was a forced decrease that happened because of this brain tumor. I went to my primary care doctor and kind of described some symptoms, and she was like, you need to go to the ER. So I went immediately to the ER, had all the tests, and the neurosurgeon said, well, you got a tumor. And he thanked me at that point. I don't remember much in the hospital, but I do remember that he thanked me because I came in to the ER, because it would have been really, really bad if I hadn't done that. But in God's providence, there was a forced decrease for me. Before that happened, I was a quick learner. But after the surgery, I had memory issues. It was very difficult to learn something. I remember learning the Greek alphabet. It took a couple hours. Then I learned the Hebrew alphabet. It took like 3 weeks of study. So it was very difficult to learn after that. I was athletic before that. I did a lot of team sports and a lot of active activities. But after the surgery, I had to learn how to walk again. I remember shuffling down the hospital corridors, on a walker, using a walker. So, so much for being athletic. I was well-spoken before surgery, but after the surgery, I had to relearn how to talk. And, if you know anything about ministry, it's a lot of talking, and it was very difficult, very, very difficult to do that. And even now, I struggle with, communicating all the time my thoughts. I have to really think about what I'm going to say, although it's a whole lot easier now than it was right after the surgery. Again, before the surgery, I had endurance. It was easy to work, like a 16-hour day. That was, no problem. Now, not so much. Right after the surgery, I traded 16-hour work days for 16-hour sleep days, and I'm not joking. Sometimes I would sleep that long. I think my record was 17 hours. So God stripped that away from me. He wanted me to decrease. He wanted me to not rely on my own abilities. And even now, I still have health problems. And I wouldn't change a thing. Going through that, I wouldn't change a thing, because God worked so graciously in my life to decrease me as he increased himself through me and in ministry. Now, the result of all that, because he really stripped away by his providence all the things that I could do, right? It was all about me. It was the Bret show. But after that, he stripped all that stuff away, and the result was severe depression. Like Spurgeon had, but apparently he had it for different reasons than what I had it for. And it was daily for 6 years, about 6 years, this severe depression. And I remember it was really kind of at the end of my rope, kind of figuring out what was really going on. I remember I was listening to a little bit of Paul Washer's sermon where he talked about, I think it was spiritual performance, talking about relying on your own strength to do things. And I was truly convicted by that sermon. And I repented of that. And I was relying too much on my own talents and abilities to do things, rather than on Christ and his power to truly affect change in me and in other people. And that's really what happened. That's true. Now, once I had been convicted and once I'd repented from it, the result was that God graciously lifted that depression immediately and permanently. I haven't had a day of depression since December of 2020, and I can't explain that medically. I can only explain that God had grace upon me and allowed me to. He lifted that from me and allowed me to not have to deal with that any longer. That is what God wanted me to learn in my life so far, to decrease, so that He can increase in my life and in my ministry.